everybody. We are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
And I'm Dr. Erin.
You are welcome back to our continuing coverage of the country of Brazil on our Colonizers World Tour. This week, we are focusing on women, gender, etc., which also means we're also still focusing on race and violence and class and everything else, because the myth that we can separate any of these things is one that we will not continue to propagate in these corners of the YouTubes. Mm-hmm. So, quick reminder, we talked about Brazil a lot last year, and so I'd imagine that what you knew coming in is the same as mine, Erin, which is that I knew it was bad because we talked about how bad it was last year.
Yeah, that's effectively. I didn't, I think the thing that struck me the most was the high rates of male violence against women and
yes.
Violence against queer folks.
Yes.
The statistical numbers for those, I didn't remember what they were from last year, but I remembered that they were really high and that I found it upsetting.
Yeah, especially for transgendered individuals. Ability to culturally and medically transition is limited in a lot of areas. Physical safety of anyone who falls outside of the definitions of acceptable gender is questionable. But then, especially for males assigned at birth who transition to women, this is very, very fraught. But for women in general, outside of that particular intersection, it's just not great. Job opportunities are hard. Poverty is backbreaking. Slavery and sex trafficking is massive. We talked a lot last week about slavery, and we just touched on the sexual exploitation of women and girls. But one of the things I do want to note is that I searched high and long for data on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Brazil, like we have some numbers in North America. Could not find a significant conversation happening about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Brazil. So I would guess that all of our numbers are wrong and only a fraction of what is reported. And we always, when we're talking about violence, want to remind people that violence, intimate partner violence, is grossly underreported. So if we ever quote statistics in this, they're worse than the ones that we quote, because that is human nature and culture and everything else. But what we really want to do today is dig into kind of how Brazilian society has formed gender, how gender then forms Brazilian society, and kind of everything else with that, and take the more sociological view than just the man, it really sucks view. So, in terms of gender, obviously one of the biggest factors in any country about how it affects things is institutionalized religion of the place. So we got to talk about the Catholic Church, and then as the Catholic Church began to wane, good news for everyone, i.e., no one. No, that's really mean and cynical. I'm showing my cards. I apologize, everybody. So, as the Catholic Church began to wane, the evangelical Protestant pseudo-Pentecostal movement kind of came in, and a lot of the movements that we see in the 90s in North America, we also see in Brazil in terms of the religious push to conservatize or save the nation in some way and think of the children. We see that push in Brazil as well. There are two other major factors that contribute a lot to the performance of gender, to the lived experience of gender, and that is the concept and the celebration of Carnival, and the presence of telenovelas in Brazilian society. We could also talk about the presence of soap operas in British society, and maybe we should someday.
Boy, the sociology of Emmerdale.
Of EastEnders. Could we have...
And Coronation Street, yeah.
Oh, man. And The Doctors, that random one that still airs at like 4 o'clock on Channel 4. Yeah. That Gleb was in after he left Anastasia.
Bless.
I digress, we're back. So in talking about Carnival, we're going to quote here from 2 books pretty extensively over the next 2 videos that we both read. Erin read a book by Michael Reed called Brazil, The Troubled Rise of a Global Power. And I read a book called Football Nation by David Goldblatt. And they both really inform this week and next week. So we'll be quoting them a lot. In terms of Carnival, what I'm going to quote directly from Michael Reed here to talk about Carnival, its orgiastic character is in part because of the weather, but also its origins stem from the cultures of the 3 founding peoples of Brazil, the Amerindians, the Portuguese, and the Africans. They are generally sexually tolerant as a people for a host of reasons. And this has always flown in the face of some other global Catholicism. So it's really interesting because they might be sexually tolerant, but they're not tolerant on the definition of family or the role once you become married. So interesting. So really, editorial comment from Kristen. I wouldn't say they're sexually tolerant as they are body tolerant. Because I'm not entirely sure they are sexually tolerant, to be completely frank.
Yeah.
They don't have the puritanical relationship with bodies that North Americans do. And because of that, Brazilians devote more of their disposable income to beauty and personal care products than anywhere else in the world. Bodies are more of a calling card in Brazil than they are in a lot of other places. They also have a massive plastic surgery industry that only continues to grow as the middle class gains more spending power. This sexual freedom that, once again, I would argue is actually body freedom, because there's a lot of Brazilian women that will stand, I've seen in documentaries and news reports, that will be standing in a string bikini talking about how important it is for men to marry women, and like espousing these really, really what we think of as conservative values that would not ever be espoused by somebody wearing a string bikini in North America, and we see that as incongruous. It's not incongruous in Brazilian society. But they have the evangelicalism. So Catholicism, in terms of the religion, and we'll get into that in a minute, does not bring in this hard work is necessary thing. So the hard work is necessary to be a good person is a Protestant entity. It's a Protestant mindset for a whole host of reasons that I've talked about on other videos. So this kind of hyper conservatization looked different under Catholic Brazil. As we get evangelical Protestant Brazil, we have this message of teetotalism that comes in, which is not really ever part of Catholicism, even though they pretend it is sometimes. Hard work and advancement. And one of the reasons that it really works in Brazil is that it recruits a lot of poor and Black Brazilians with the prosperity gospel, which I'll get into in a couple minutes. So Carnival is this very interesting expression of body freedom that exists within an increasingly conservative country. So there's that. The other idea of telenovelas, and there's one video, I can't remember which one it is, that is linked in our show notes, in which there's a woman talking about how that the way that telenovelas tell the story of who Brazil is who Brazil becomes. Mm-hmm. And so she wishes that there weren't gay love stories, because then kids get ideas, is the way that she says it. Which is common as well in the rest of the world. Well, the reason we have this, the reason that kids commit violence is video games. But with the power of stories and telenovelas, it does shine light. It's not that it turns people gay, but it says that it's okay to be gay out loud. Yeah. And that's really what happens. I would make the argument as well that telenovelas really came in at a time where the Catholic Church's power was waning. And so this power of what does it mean to be Brazilian before telenovelas, what it meant to be Brazilian really, and before the rise of television, was to be Catholic and to play football and to do some other things. And as television kind of came in, which television came into Brazil because of football, by the way, that's the 1950 whatever World Cup is the first time they had a national communication service. So we get these stories because of football. Once the Catholic Church started waning, it goes to these telenovelas. And I think entertainment and capitalism, a lot of places around the world, we see marry to become the cultural arbiters of what it means to be XYZ. And that's what we get in Brazil as well, as the power of telenovelas. Again, I will say, this is quoting from Reed, telenovelas are often criticized for showing an idealized white and plutocratic Brazil, but they do address sociopolitical issues, especially around sexuality and violence. Those are some of the places in blogs I was reading and TikToks I was watching over the last little bit that some of these more marginalized communities feel actually tell any level of a story about them. Is those. Globo TV is the largest television network. 70% of their audience live outside the big cities, which are conservatives, much more conservative, and where people watch television as a family. So advocates for telenovelas pressing the boundaries cite this statistic as this is how we tell those kids that they're not alone. This is how we tell those families, those women, that they can leave. It almost becomes church. It almost becomes the same kind of proselytizing that a cultural acceptance of the Catholic Church used to pretend it enjoyed, and it never did. And telenovelas has, for a lot of people, become that. So that's kind of the big cultural soup here. Telenovelas and Carnival are two of the big reasons that we address gender in Brazil the way that we do. Another is this shift between the Catholic Church and the evangelical Protestants, in which I'll be honest, even though lots of people say that's a big shift, it's not. Not when it comes to bodies and sexuality. Not when it comes to the definition of family. It is in some other ways, including this work culture that we're not really touching. And that we tie some things to heaven differently. But really what it comes down to is that there's still a lot of definitions of the right kind of sexuality, the right kind of family dynamics, the right way to do things. And that has been there since Brazil was essentially founded, quote unquote, in 1888, which we talked about in previous videos. So just really briefly, the roles have changed. Just like we saw in the United States, as soon as prophylactics became more available, women started choosing to have less children. There was a lot of hand-wringing over this in the early 2010s about the fact that in the 1960s, I should say, the average birth rate was 6 children per woman. Average was 6 children per woman. By the time we hit 2011, it is 2 children per woman. And there was lots of population hand-wringing. They're fine. They still have a lot of people. They're fine. Dilma Rousseff's election as president also changed a lot of women's perceptions of themselves and power availabilities in the workplace, the same way that we saw, even though Margaret Thatcher was very conservative and was not a feminist, it also shifted a lot of women's beliefs that they could work outside the home and that it was okay, and what that kind of looked like. So when we see women in power and political power around the world, we do see shifting perceptions of the cognitive abilities of women and what that looks like. But as much as things shifted with Dilma, they have shifted back with Bolsonaro, who is the current president, if you hadn't heard us rant about him before. Since 2019 and his control of the budget, funding for women's programs has decreased by 27%. And there has been an increase in intimate partner violence and a lot of other things in the COVIDs. And we'll talk more about COVID next week, COVID in particular next week in the video. Everywhere, every article I read talk about women feeling unsafe. Anyone who identifies as a woman feels unsafe in some way, shape, or form. And there's lots of situations in which I feel unsafe. I can't fathom feeling that level of unsafe all the time.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the really interesting things was the one video examining why women support Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
Even though he has said really explicitly, like, not nice things about gender and sexuality and women and all of these things. Very famously told a reporter that she was too ugly to be raped. So it came as a surprise to a lot of people that then there were a lot of women supporting Bolsonaro, but it was this idea of fear and security and protection that was outweighing the negative things he was saying about women, because he was promising to deal with crime and security and violence. And they saw the fact that he was a former captain in the military as proof that he was capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And I thought that was one of the more interesting explorations, because you would look at it and you would think a person who is that explicitly
misogynistic,
that was the word, thank you, and sexist would not have a lot of support from women. But and there are a lot of women who protest him and continue to protest him to this day. But he does have a lot more support from women electorally than you would think necessarily. And so for me, it was interesting to see that was the issue that kind of tipped them into the Bolsonaro camp, was this promise of protection. It's not manifested. It has not happened in Bolsonaro's presidency. But so we will see what the rhetoric is politically leading up to this election in October 2022, and what kind of statistics we have about whether he is still supported by those same numbers of women.
Yeah. So really briefly about the differences between how the Protestant church talks about women and how the Catholic church talks about women, to explain one of the ways that this has shifted. So in the Catholic church, generally, women are not necessarily denigrated. They are not made to be silent. They're not, they still have roles. They just don't have control. They have immense power because women are revered not only because because Mary is revered, but because one of the most important role a woman plays in the Catholic church is to bear children. That's it. That's why they are so anti, prophylactics. They're so anti-family planning. And a lot of very devout Catholics would argue that they're not anti-women at all. And you can see their train of logic there, because to them, this is a revered place. And if a woman doesn't want that place, it does not compute. They just doesn't. Why wouldn't you want to be worshipped? Why wouldn't you want this role that you've been created for? So it's not as much about controlling their bodies in the motivations as it is about actually promoting them to where they think their real gift lies for the church. Protestant movements are a little bit different. Protestant movements, women are seen as actually a much more significant threat to the power of men. And some of this, I'll be very frank, is that some of the founders of the Protestant movements had very fraught relationships with women. Martin Luther, John Wesley. I just named essentially all of Protestantism, and then Methodism, in case you were wondering, the two founders of. They have very fraught relationships with women, and they didn't know what to do with them. And they were surrounded by a lot of very smart women that they were fairly scared of. In some ways, and didn't really know what to do with that. And that legacy has continued. So in Protestantism, women are frequently silenced as a matter of sinning. So because there isn't the system in the Protestant church there is in the Catholic, where only priests can give sermons and women can't be priests, so we're not even having this conversation. The debate over women physically speaking in churches is massive in Protestant land. Massive. There are churches in Protestant land in which women cannot even read scripture. There's not many Catholic churches where women can't read scripture. They're fine with that. They just can't preach the sermon and they can't serve communion. But the problem is not their gender, it's that they're not priests. You and I, as I'm talking about this, are right, but they could let them be priests. I was like, yes, but in the average Catholic's mind, that doesn't even enter the conversation. Mm. Most Protestant churches, most Protestants know what they think about women and preaching. Either they have a definitive opinion on it because they have one, or because their church has one. It is a stance you have to take. So what does this mean is that there's not this very definitive kind of holy place for women within Protestantism that we can elevate women to. We don't know what to do with them. They're constantly threatening the power structure because we never figured out a place to put them. We had nuns, we figured out where to put them, but we never figured out what to do with women, and us rascally women just kept asking for power.
Ugh, so pesky.
So then when we get evangelical Protestantism, which is this big belief, especially in the 90s and the way it manifested in Brazil, which is with prosperity gospel, the belief that if you pray and you're a really good person, God will give you money. If, as Americans, you may be more familiar with this in the personhood of Joel Osteen. He is the pastor of prosperity gospel. And this belief that then money will set you free, which is a complete aberration of this other theological movement that was rising at the time called liberation theology that I would love to talk about another time. But I will not make any of you sit through that. So the problem with all of this is that then fertility became a threat because women were not necessarily raising them in the Protestant church or in the right way. Fertility, women's bodies became something we had to control because we couldn't trust them out to make their own fertility decisions, because we couldn't trust them to make any decision because we don't know what to do with them. So we cannot trust them. Women are not to be trusted. We have to just keep controlling them. So again, their bodies are not necessarily the problem in Brazil. Mm. Their sexuality and their reproductive choices are. So in the States, all of those things are the same because of our civic religion based on puritanical values. In a lot of other places around the world, bodies and reproductive choices are separated. So, and I want to say too, there's lots of Catholic countries where this looked different. Latin American Catholicism is its own ballgame. So I am just talking about Brazil and how it functioned in Brazil. They were a lot less concerned with bodies as they were with organs. The Irish Catholic Church has been concerned with everything.
All things.
but the Brazilian Catholic Church was not quite as concerned with bodies on the whole. On the whole. You can find me crazy ass priests, but on the whole, this was their thing. So where does that leave us now in the 2020s as religion continues to decline? Pseudo-Pentecostalism continues, which is what it really is. Prosperity gospel Pentecostalism continues to have incredible wealth, influence, and power within Brazil, especially with the rise of the internet. I don't know if Bolsonaro claims to be a Christian, but I read a lot of places and saw a lot of TikToks where people use the same language for him as people used for Trump about being anointed and some other things like that. So I don't know Bolsonaro's faith. I feel fairly confident in talking about Donald Trump's, to be completely frank. But I don't know what Bolsonaro claims. And so the issue here is the controlling and the perception of reproductive choices, which is another reason I think that trans women really confuse a lot of Brazilians, because we're taking reproductive stuff out of the conversation in a lot of ways, and then they don't know what to do. So there's a lot of messiness here. Also, the absolute need to control women's reproduction and life and everything else is one of the big reasons for the propensity of violence against women. It's, again, not as much about their bodies in the way that Americans think about it, because I've absolutely heard American Christians talk about Brazilian women as whores because of how they dress. And that Carnival is this like celebration of sin because of dancing around in bikinis. No, it's not. Believe it or not, they have some of the same cultural values as like the most conservative religious Protestant group in Kansas. That just physically looks different because of how they view bodies. So hopefully that didn't confuse people more and it shed a little bit of light on things. Ask me any questions. I'm going to stop talking now, and we're going to move on to one of Dr. Hinson's hobby horses. Now that we're done with my hobby horse, let's head to yours, dear.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot to add to the discussion we've already had in several of our videos about Indigenous gender and sexuality and indigeneity in that intersection. I did learn some new things in this week and this focus. They aren't necessarily surprising given the relationship we've already kind of outlined between Indigenous people groups and the more dominant cultural groups in Brazil. Indigenous women are drastically underrepresented in political spaces. Indigenous people are, full stop. The first congresswoman was elected in 1982, and I believe that is still the only congresswoman. I could be wrong. The first Indigenous woman ran for vice president in 2018. We talked about male violence against women and the femicide rates in Brazil. It is twice as high for Indigenous women as it is for non-Indigenous women. The suicide rate is twice as high for Indigenous women as non-Indigenous women. And there also seems to be a correlation between the conflicts over land and the control of land and resources, and especially the intersection with the economy appears to have driven up homicide rates of Indigenous women as well. They have been in the news most recently as leading the protests against Bolsonaro and the protests to save their ancestral lands from this economic expansion. So there's a lot of articles in the Google Doc, specifically in the section under gender and sexuality, about Indigenous women leading a lot of the protests in the last number of years. So that was exciting to see something positive about Indigenous women after all the stuff that I just told you. Women make up almost half of the Brazilians' 900,000 native peoples. So, they're half the population in most places around the world. It's true for their population percentage within Indigenous people groups. There was not a lot that I found accessible online about LGBTQ plus voices in indigeneity. So I can make some educated guesses for why that is. Indigenous people usually have very different understandings of gender and sexuality than Western concepts or the concepts that colonizers bring, especially through religion. And so the impact of colonization is also something that I talk about in my section of these videos. And I would say, by and large, that's one of the bigger ones that we always see. The prescription of specific gender roles, the identity, the definition of gender at all, the influence of the Catholic Church and the Portuguese understandings of gender and sex have a huge impact on Brazilian history and the way that they still view these. I don't know about specific ideas of gender and sexuality for specific Amerindian groups in Brazil. There's lots of concepts historically in indigeneity of gender fluidity. There's a concept in kind of North American indigeneity of two-spirit, which is not the same as non-binary or gender. It's tied more to religion, but it's often a word that is used to talk about queer folks in Indian country here. So it's really complicated, and you can't speak for the particular faith beliefs and perceptions of gender and sexuality for was it like 500 different indigenous groups that
massive,
existed
a massive
in Brazil.
amount, yeah.
But it's worth pointing out, like, on a larger scale around the world, there has often been a lot more gender fluidity and sexuality fluidity within indigenous groups, and I would imagine it's very similar. And so that's why we don't get this demarcation and this distinction of LGBTQ voices. I'm sure there are queer folks, queer indigenous folks in Brazil that are talking about what it's like to be queer and indigenous in Brazil. I did not find any of them.
Yeah, and I looked on TikTok, and the ones that might be were in Portuguese.
Yeah.
So it was, it was a little hard to. TikTok doesn't come with captions.
Right.
So.
And there's a limit to the resources that we can access.
Yeah.
So, I would finish my portion of talking about indigeneity and colonization just by saying, if there is anybody who wants to talk about being queer and indigenous in Brazil with us, we would love to have that conversation. But it's an interesting exploration of that, and I think it ties in really well to the conversation that you had about understanding the socio-religious culture that exists in Brazil. So the last item on my checklist is to talk about human rights and gender and sexuality.
This is probably where I learned the most.
Yeah, I learned a lot more than I remembered learning last year.
Yeah.
So as per usual, there's real big differences between laws and culture. I mean, that's just the world over. So on paper, Brazil looks super progressive.
Yep.
Compared to a lot of other places where it's illegal to be gay.
Yeah.
Comparatively. It looks super progressive on paper. Civil unions are legal. Trans folks can change their name. Explicit discrimination against gender and sexuality is illegal. Conversion therapy is banned. All that sounds like
a wonderland.
We're ticking all the yeses in the column here for whether it's a good experience for women and queer folks in Brazil. But then when we look at the culture of it, 68% of Brazilian LGBTQ plus people experience homophobia in the workplace.
This is also one of those times to remind us all how big Brazil is.
It's massive. Massive. It has the highest instances. This is the thing that shocked me. It's not my Jeopardy facts, but it is the thing that shocked me. Brazil has the highest instances of child marriage in South America.
Yeah, that's when you typed that to me, I was like, really?
Though the legal age of marriage in Brazil is 18. That's the legal age of consent. There is an exception in the law for pregnant females 16 years and older. So in 2016, 36% of girls were married before they turned 18.
And that's the Catholic Church hangover.
That there is an exception in
for pregnant.
That if you are pregnant, you have to be married.
Yep, that's a Catholic Church hangover. Yep.
Yeah. So super cool, super cool. An interesting connection between like queer life and safety and security and colonization is that a lot of queer folks actually left Brazil after Bolsonaro was elected and emigrated to Portugal.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because they can get a visa and they can get free healthcare because there's this like loophole, colonizer's loophole. So there's a great like little docu video in our Google Doc that interviews a handful of queer folks, Brazilian queer folks who now live in Portugal. And they talk about what it was like culturally to live in Brazil during the election season up to Bolsonaro, and the things that he was saying and the way that they felt unsafe in their country, in their, what are they called? States, the states in Brazil, in their towns, at their workplaces, etc. So that's, we've seen a rise in homophobic attacks since the election of Bolsonaro. In Brazil, a queer person is killed every 16 hours. And the life expectancy of a transgender person is 35 years old.
It's not good.
It's not good. But trans folks, feminist people, and queer folks were elected in higher numbers in the 2020 election. Cool. So again, that's good news. A lot of them faced threats and violence.
Not good news.
Which is not good news. But this is another thing where there's a difference between big cultures and small cultures and generations, right? So we might see a generational shift in perspectives on what it means to be queer and Brazilian or Indigenous and Brazilian or a woman and Brazilian as we get this generational shift. So we are seeing an increase in the election of people from historically marginalized groups, which I think is what I'll end on, because I think that feels a bit more positive than the 16 hours statistic, which is still one of the more horrific statistics I've ever heard in my life. But we'll stop with maybe there's hope, and if for representation, if they don't get killed. One of the political like a queer feminist that was elected in office was murdered. But a lot of people.
So you're like, I'm going to give you hope, and here, let me just continue to dash it.
But a lot of
we've got to work on your storytelling structures, babe.
I know, but a lot of people were upset about her death, and it prompted a lot of other people to run for office. So
okay.
There, I will end on hope. What was your Jeopardy fact for this sunshine and rainbows time we had talking about gender and sexuality?
In the show notes, there is a video called Inside Brazil's Biggest Prison Beauty Pageant from Vice.
Y'all.
If you have never clicked on a single one of our resources, I understand. But I behoove you to click on this one.
I beseech you.
It is my favorite mini documentary that I've seen in a long time. And it literally tells the story. It does what it says on the tin. Thank you, Vice. Brazil's biggest prison beauty pageant. I loved it. I loved that the prison beauty pageant exists in Brazil. I love that there are people that donate heels because most of the women have only been in flats for 4 years, and heels are a big part of their feminine identity. I love the Mr. Max category for the queer folks who do not identify as women and do not want to be in a female beauty pageant, but still want to be in a pageant because pageant culture is so big in Brazil. I loved everything about this, top to bottom. And I love that, like, massive superstars were the judges. Like, this isn't something that happens quietly. Like, it's like Eurovision level joy.
And they were all brought in by the prison, like, infrastructure, the prison authorities and the governorship. They paid to have, like, to bring in
pageant coaches.
A pageant coach to help them, who's like this massive pageant coach. They paid to have hair and makeup, professional hair and makeup for these humans.
And my favorite thing I learned was the guy, and this statistic could be erroneous, but it's still a good point, is that like 90% of the women in prison are there because of love. Love of family, love of children, love of partner.
Oh boy, yeah.
And like I could sit with that for a little while. But yeah, please watch that video.
Oh my gosh.
Please. It is free on the YouTubes, and it will bring a giant smile to your face. And it is just so good. So good. That's mine. Yours is sadder, isn't it?
I know we should have gone with mine and then ended with yours. In hindsight, yeah, mine is a little bit sadder, but still makes a lot of sense, I think, for understanding the structures of gender and sex and sexuality everywhere, but also in Brazil. I learned that only men were considered the legal head of households until 1988.
That's not super far behind America.
Yeah, and I think it really kind of hammers home what that structure and the limiting mobility within that structure. Yeah. So now we see, and it's improved a lot since that change. Now we see, I believe it's upwards of 40% of Brazilian women are the head of households.
Yeah.
So we're seeing change in a lot of these areas, but it's real hard to dismantle systems that have been in existence and perpetuated since the time of colonization.
Yep.
So I still think it's hopeful that maybe my statistics should have been that it's 44, upwards of 40% are now head of households in a short time since 1988. So I will end there, that we both, I think, have found some hope for the future in this particular category of Brazil.
And our movie tomorrow that we'll be talking about is actually about one of those female-headed households. It's called The Second Mother, and it talks about the very global phenomenon of women who leave their biological children to go raise another woman's child as a live-in nanny. It was nominated, it was presented by Brazil as their foreign Oscar nomination in 2016. It was named one of the top 5 movies in Brazil in 2015. It is, my perception is that it stars like their Olivia Colman, who's this like incredible comedian, and no one was expecting her to like drag out this Broadchurch performance. So we'll be talking about it tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you then. If you enjoyed this conversation, hit the thumbs up so we can have more people join it. If you've got resources or this is a lived experience for you, as always, we'd love to talk to you, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Take care.